So welcome to everybody who's here on this beautiful Easter Sunday. Thank you for spending this day together with us. And it is a day unlike any other. And in just a couple moments, we're going to turn our attention to that message for this day. But before that, I want to give you a little bit of an update. It was in February where we shared with you as a church some of the ways in which and the directions in which we feel God is leading us, and I want to give you a little bit of an update. One of the things that we just think God is doing in the life of this church is that we would show compassion. What is compassion? Showing God's love in practical ways. And that we would do that beyond this location, beyond this campus, into our community and to people that matter so much to God. And so we mentioned three specific things, and I just want to let you know where we are with those. We said in 2018 that we want to start a garage that will do free repairs for widows, single moms, and the spouses of deployed military. And so we had a team that just went down to the city of Houston, and there's an organization doing something like that there. And so we've got some ideas together. We've heard from a lot of you that you're interested in that as well, and we will be sure to keep you in the loop as we go forward. Weber County looks pretty open to what we want to do, and so as we figure out more of those details, we're going to start heading in that direction. The second thing we talked about was to get a safe house, for lack of a better term, for women who are being rescued out of human trafficking and out of polygamy. And we've talked with some people who work in that arena, and yeah, we can applaud that. That's awesome. Human trafficking is one of the great plagues of our day. And we can't do everything, but we can do something. And so we want to start a home where there can be a place, a safe place for people to go. And we're hearing a lot of people are being rescued. The big question is, what now? What next? Where do they go? And so we want to establish that. And we've talked with some people already as a part of our church who have worked in leadership roles and capacities in similar kind of efforts. And we think that we're crystallizing a plan that can take us in that direction. And then finally, so there's the garage, the safe house, and also we talked about going into the 12th Street prison and bringing the service there, but also really it's more about the people who are going to be there from our church, come alongside the folks who are there, and to bring hope and relationship and encouragement to the people who were there. And then as people are exiting the incarceration, that there would also be people who would come alongside them and help them to get reestablished on the other side. And Pastor Jimmy, who was just up here a minute ago, he's already put together a leadership team. We've encountered a little bit of a hurdle at the Weber County Jail. Never saw that coming, where they're saying, well, we're not quite sure we need anybody else. And so I would encourage you and invite you to pray about that. And we believe that that is a part of what God has for us ahead as well. Compassion, showing God's love in practical ways. And as we go forward, we'll make sure that you're aware of what's happening, and there'll be many opportunities for you to be a part of it. So let's turn our attention to our message for today, unbelievable. And that word can be said in a couple of different ways, right? We can say simply unbelievable, in the sense that I just don't believe it. Or we can say unbelievable in the sense that it's incredible, it's amazing, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. And this day can evoke both of those expressions when it comes to the use of that word. And here's why. What this day represents separates Jesus from anyone else that this world has ever seen. See, we might point to the life of Jesus and say, look at what he said, and look at what he taught, and look at what he did. And others might say, yeah, well, there have been a lot of religious leaders, spiritual leaders, and they've said some great things, and they've done some great things. That just kind of puts Jesus in the mix of some others. And then we talk about the death of Jesus and all that's attached to that, but we might push back and say, yeah, well, a lot of people have died too, and everybody who's not alive has died, so nothing really unusual about that. But today is different. Because what Easter Sunday represents is Jesus rising again from the dead. And not in some metaphorical, mystical, spiritual sense. in a literal sense, Jesus' body was placed in a tomb. And 3 days later, Jesus, alive and well, walked out of that same tomb. And that is different. That is just different than anyone who has ever lived, anyone who has ever been here. And on this day, I know that there can also be a sense in which we respond to that by saying, yeah, you know, it's a great story, it's just simply unbelievable. Because it really is a dividing line. And we just never expect to have that be the case. Because we never see anything like it. Makes me think of a story back when I was doing one of my very first funerals a long time ago. And there was an elderly gentleman who had passed away. And in that service, one of his family members got up and spoke about an event that happened when he was a younger man in his early 20s. He worked at a facility that would put munitions together. And so they'd work with dynamite and, put them in the tubes and all of that. And this was back in the 1930s, and the conditions were pretty unsafe. There weren't a lot of regulations. Well, one day, some of those things went wrong, and there was a huge explosion, and there were a number of people who died. And so people showed up, and they loaded people, into that vehicle and took them down there. Well, he was scooped up in that group and taken down and laid out, there in the coroner's room. Well, he wasn't dead. And so all of a sudden, the coroner's in the room, and all of a sudden, this guy comes to and sits up. And the coroner who's there, who's not used to seeing that happen, he goes down. And somebody else walks in, and the guy who's supposed to be dead is alive, and the one who's supposed to be alive looks like he's dead, because we don't expect to see that. And when that happens, it would be definitely out of the ordinary. And here's what we're saying by that. When people see life where they expect only death, it's unbelievable. But you might say, but you know what? Your story points out the very issue with that, because the guy wasn't really dead. And so what if the events surrounding this claim about Jesus rising again from the dead, what if they are not what they appear to be? What if it's a story? What if people lied? What if people got together and created a scenario that they point back to, but it never really happened the way that they claim? So what I want to do here with us in the time that we have is I want to check in with one of the biographers of Jesus' life. His name is John, one of the disciples who walked with him for 3 years. And John's not only going to share what his experience was like and some of the other followers of Jesus, but after he talks about Jesus' life and death and now his resurrection, he zeroes in on 3 individual stories of what happened on the other side of that event. And I believe that can not only help us to understand that the claim of this day is in fact true, but also I think it speaks to us in this day just as much as it did to those people in that day. So let's jump in. John chapter 20. That Sunday evening, Easter Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Why are they afraid? Because they think we could be next. I mean, they took Jesus out and he was a threat and we were with him. Why wouldn't they come after us? Because maybe they just want to exterminate this whole thing altogether. So picture them behind locked doors, afraid that they might be the next ones taken in, put on trial, and maybe even nailed to a Roman cross, just like Jesus was. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Were they expecting that moment? No, they were scared. They were hiding out and protecting themselves. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. They were filled with great joy when they saw the Lord. What turns fear into joy virtually in just a moment? It's not what they were anticipating. It's not what they were expecting. It's simply, John says, that's what happened. 1 minute we're scared, the next minute we're joyful. What changed? One singular event, unlike any other event. The Jesus that they saw suffer and die was with them and was alive and well. Those guys leave that room in which they had barricaded themselves, And they are the most courageous and, just focused people who turned the world upside down. What changed? What transformed them? One singular event, unlike any other. But they weren't the only ones. Now, John begins to zero in on some of those individual stories that follow. And also in John chapter 20, we find Mary Magdalene's story. And let me just back up a little bit. The Bible tells us that when Mary met Jesus, she was possessed by 7 demons. And you can just imagine what that behavior and that look was like. Maybe it's like some of the people that we see wandering around, and they don't look real good, and they don't smell real good, and it just looks like you want to keep your distance. This is the crazy lady, crazy Mary. But Jesus transforms that and delivers her from that. And then we find Mary as one of Jesus' closest followers. But then he dies. And all the hope that she had pinned in him seems to die with him. And so early on Easter Sunday morning, we're told that Mary is making her way down to the tomb. And she's bringing with her some spices to anoint Jesus' body. That was an ancient way of caring for bodies that were deceased. And so what is she expecting? She's expecting to find Jesus' body still dead. And she gets to the tomb, and the large stone that is rolled to cover the opening there has been rolled aside, and the tomb is empty. And so what is her assumption? Check out what John records for us. All of a sudden, there's someone standing next to her. She doesn't know who it is yet. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. She is overcome with her grief. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him," Jesus, away, "tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." She comes with the spices expecting a dead body. She finds an empty tomb, and what is her assumption? Somebody took him away, took his body away. "If it was you, would you tell me where it is so I can go and get him?" She wants to honor and respect Jesus' body. And then Jesus speaks one word to her. Something about Mary Magdalene, we may think Magdalene was her last name. It's not. Magdala, or Migdal, was a small fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. And it was the low-rent district. And so in the Bible, a lot of times what you have is people reference to their relationships. So Jesus, son of Joseph. Well, to say Mary Magdalene, she's not connected to any person. She's connected to where she comes from, and it's not that great of a place. It's like saying Mary of the docks, Mary from the wrong side of the tracks. And the implication of that is she doesn't have anybody. She's not connected to anyone. And in her experience with Jesus, she finds what she has not found anywhere else. But now it seems like all of that has come to an end. And even at this point in the story, still, she's wondering, who took the body away? Because I'll go get it and bring it back. And then the one that she mistakes for the gardener simply says one word, Mary. Not even Mary Magdalene. Not the association, the negative association that others put on her or were given to her. Simply Mary. You know what Mary Magdalene's story tells us? It tells us it's unbelievable. I matter to God. Somebody like me, from not such a great place, not such a great life experience. Oh, we know who that is. That's the crazy lady. Jesus says, Mary. And in that moment, Mary becomes the very first person to see the risen Jesus and to put all of her hope and her trust in him. And Jesus promises that he has to go away, but he is never going to leave her or forsake her. And he offers her an unconditional kind of love unlike anything else. I don't know where you're from or the connections maybe that have been attached to you. Do you know what this day tells us in no uncertain terms? You matter to God. You matter to God. And he offers to you the very same promise that inside of a relationship with him, he will never leave you or forsake you, come what may. There's a story to that effect that I came across. Guy's name is Dave Rover, and Dave Rover served in Vietnam, and he was given a pretty dangerous assignment there. He had to work with some phosphorus materials. Well, one day, some of that exploded. It got all over him, and a large portion of his body was burned. And he was flown back stateside, and he was put into a hospital in a burn unit. He shared that room with another guy who had also been burned in much the same way that he was. And the other guy that he was sharing the room with, one day his wife came to see him for the very first time. And she walked into that room, and she took off her wedding band, and she placed it on his chest, and she said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." And she walked out. And that guy shook with grief and sadness, and 2 days later, he was gone. He was dead. And so Dave just readies himself for his own wife's visit. And then one day it comes, and she walks into the room, and his wife, her name is Brenda. And Brenda happens to be a follower of Jesus, and she has a little bit of a sense of humor, too. She walks in, she takes a look at Dave, and all the burns that she could see, the rest covered with bandages, and she says, "You know, Dave, in some ways, this is an improvement." And she says, "Dave, let's do whatever we need to do to get you out of here." And in just a couple of weeks, he was at a rehab facility. In a matter of months, he was back home. And let me show you just a little image of them not that long ago. There they are. And that's a picture of unconditional love. Of come what may, I will not leave you. And that kind of love is powerful. And it is the kind of love that Mary experienced on that morning when she saw Jesus alive. And it is the very same kind of love that Jesus offers you, no matter who you are. Unbelievable. You matter to God. No matter where you come from. No matter what you look like. Doesn't matter what's been a part of your experience, a part of your journey. You matter to God. Well, maybe your bigger issue is that you have some doubts. And Thomas's story is recorded for us also in John chapter 20. And I believe Thomas gets a little bit of a bad rap because if you have been around church for any length of time, you know that Thomas has a nickname. We call him what, Thomas? Doubting Thomas, right? I think that's a little bit unfair. When you see somebody suffer and die and then be placed in a tomb and some people just say, "Hey, you know what? He's back." Yeah, right. I don't know about you. I'm a little skeptical about that myself. And so Thomas is looking for some evidence. He's looking for some proof. And so here's what plays out one day. They, that's the disciples, told him, Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." But he, Thomas, replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side." I don't know about you. I think that's reasonable. I think to say, yeah, you know what? I'm just not going to take your word for it. You're going to have to give me a little bit more than that. And we call him Doubting Thomas. I think he is Rational Thomas, who's saying, you know, is there a little bit more to go on here than just what somebody says? Well, then Jesus makes a special appearance to Thomas. Then he, Jesus, said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand in the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." And Thomas's response is exactly that. He makes this expression, "My Lord and my God," which is saying, you're the leader and you are God in the flesh. And he steps across that line of belief. Now, we might be here and say, well, that's great for Thomas, But where is my evidence? Where is my proof? Because Jesus isn't here doing that same thing of offering, us to see the wounds and put our fingers in them. While that's not the case, faith in the Jesus of the Bible is not as much of a leap into the dark as you might imagine. And that there is reason and rationality around faith and even the incredible event of Jesus' resurrection that's claimed on a day like this. You might say, well, like what? What makes it reasonable? There are many things we could point to. Let me just mention 3 of them real quickly. The one is an empty tomb. And there were a lot of opponents to Jesus in that day. And wouldn't it have been easy if the empty tomb was still filled with a body to just produce the body? Or if it had been taken, that there would be some way to find it and produce it and parade it down the streets and just end this nonsense about somebody who died and came back from the dead. But none of that was ever accomplished. Could it be that a reasonable and rational explanation of that is it actually happened? It actually happened. Because the many opponents of Jesus had a lot to gain by producing that body and a lot to lose by it never showing up. Then you also have some eyewitness accounts. And we've already mentioned this. Mary Magdalene was the very first one, and there's a number of women that are mentioned in connection with seeing Jesus on that day. Here's why that's significant. In the first century, in a court of law, women's testimony was considered invalid. Now, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what it was. And if you were creating a story about someone dying and coming back from life in that culture, would you list some of the very first eyewitnesses to that event being the ones who had absolutely no credibility? Could it rationally and reasonably be that it's recorded that way because that's the way it actually happened? And how about this guy? His name is James. James is the brother of Jesus. How many people here have a sibling? Can I see your hands? How many, just had interesting kind of times with your sibling? I'm the youngest of 3, which explains a lot all by itself. And I have an older brother. And one time, my older brother sat on me for an entire TV show. And so that explains a whole lot, too. Still working through some issues in my life, okay? And what would it take? Let me ask you a question. Everybody's got a sibling. What would it take for your sibling to convince you that they're the Son of God? Probably they'd have to come back from the dead, right? Because I ain't believing it with my brother, unless something like that happens. And James, when Jesus was growing up and he first went public with his ministry, James, along with the rest of Jesus' family, they were not on board with Jesus. In fact, they thought he was a little bit crazy. They did not believe in him. And they actually tried to shut down some of the things that he was doing because it probably would bring a whole lot of embarrassment, they thought, to their family. But then afterwards, James becomes this proponent and this follower of Jesus. And how do you explain going from a critic and now being a committed follower of Jesus? And it's not recorded for us, but I wonder if Jesus came back and when he appeared to his brother, says, I'm back. Who's crazy now, bro? I'm here. But James, like so many others, makes that radical shift. And not only did they change, they were willing to even give up their lives for it. With one exception, all of Jesus' disciples face the end of their lives saying, I will not and I cannot deny what I have seen and what I have experienced. Can't do it. And so let me ask you a question. Would you die for a lie? And if you could come up with maybe one person who could cross the board, it's just not reasonable. It's just not rational. So you have an empty tomb, you have some eyewitness accounts, you also have the emergence of the church. It is referred to, the growth, the explosive growth of this thing called the church 2,000 years ago is often referred to as one of history's mysteries. Nothing like it. What would account for that? People were as skeptical then as they are now. What would account for it? Could it be that a rational, reasonable explanation for that is that it actually happened? And that all the eyewitnesses, we're told there were over 500 of them, who saw Jesus alive again, that there was the opportunity for many to say, yeah, we've never seen anything like that. That's a dividing line of faith. If that happened, my hope, my trust is in that one who lived and died and came back to life. You know what Thomas's story tells us? It's unbelievable. We can have and build a confident faith. It's not just a wishful thinking, blind leap into the dark, that it is based on actual events that happened in this world, and that they have everything to do with everybody who's here. But it's not just taking somebody else's word for it. That it's something that can transform us and maybe even draw us across that line of faith where we say, my Lord and my God, because you, Jesus, are unlike any other. Well, maybe your story is a little bit different, and maybe you can relate to Peter's story. If you know anything about Peter, this is recorded in John 21. He was one of Jesus' disciples right from the beginning, and I got to tell you, he was courageous and bold in his faith. You know, there was a time where Jesus invited, him to get out of a boat, and for a matter of seconds, he was walking on the water, but then he takes his eyes off Jesus, begins to fear, begins to sink, and a lot of times he gets a bad rap for that, but I'm thinking he was the only one who got out of the boat. There's more upside in his story than there is downside. He made some amazing statements of faith and confidence in Jesus, but man, he blew it big time too. And maybe most of all, it was on the night that Jesus gathered together with his disciples and his friends, and he told them not only was he going to suffer and die, but that all of his disciples would betray him and abandon him. And Peter gets up, puffs his chest out, and in front of all the others says, even if all the others abandon you, Jesus, I never will. I'm Peter, I'm the rock. And sure enough, just as Jesus predicted, the next day, Peter swore that he did not know him. And when I say swore, I don't mean swear an oath. I'm talking sailor swear. That he does not know him, and he runs the other way. And the Bible records for us that he weeps bitterly over what he has done and how he has failed the one who showed him nothing but grace. We read that account before of how Jesus appears to the disciples in the room when they're locked behind those doors. Do you know who else is not there? Peter. You know why? Because he's quit. He's gone back to what he did before he ever met Jesus, and that's fishing. And so Jesus goes and finds him. And he's on the edge of that lake and provides this miraculous catch of fish. And in that moment, Peter knows that's Jesus, and he's back, and he gets out of the boat, and he runs to the shore, and in one of the most intimate scenes in all of the Bible, there is Jesus cooking breakfast for his friend who has let him down in a way that few have. And Jesus says to Peter on that day, he says, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I love you. And Jesus asks him a second time, do you love me? You know I do. Well, then feed my sheep. And then a third time, he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked this question a third time. And to him, probably at that moment, it feels like Jesus turning the knife a little bit. What? Jesus said, or that's actually Peter, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Jesus asks 3 present tense questions, and he gives 3 future tense opportunities. It's not over. I have something for you. Get back in the game. Not once does Jesus bring up the past. He talks about the present, he talks about the future, and about Peter's opportunity to be a part of that. Here's what Peter's story tells us. And I think everybody can relate to this. Unbelievable. I can be completely forgiven. Because one of the things that we all share in common, we're very different in this room, all different stories and backgrounds and everything. But I'm sure that one of the things we share in common is that sense of regret and maybe guilt that goes along with us. Peter's story and what happens on the other side of Jesus coming back to life again tells us, incredible. You can be completely forgiven. And sometimes we think, well, I know if I blow it in some way, I need to make it right and I need to work it off. Making it right with people, that's awesome. But who do we think we are when we think that somehow we can undo what we have done to make us right with a holy God? Not a chance. That's why Jesus came. And there is more grace in Jesus than there is sin in you. And because of that, we can truly be forgiven. Now, are you talking about this thing? Yep. How about that? Yep. Whatever you can come up with can be completely forgiven. But it's not your doing, and it's not mine. It's His doing. And when Jesus took on death, He came out alive and well on the other side. And what He did when He died on the cross was take all of your sin upon Him and make payment for it. And then He was back. And He invites anybody who's given up and maybe put themselves beyond the grace of God, at least in their own mind, to say that you are wonderfully wrong. You might say, well, I've never felt wonderful and been wrong at the same time. Let it be a first for you. Because in a relationship with Him, it's true. So let me ask you, what is your story? And could it be that maybe on this day you need to join your story together with His? And just like those individuals on that day, they recognized this is a dividing line. This is unlike anything else. And it's not the news that even I would expect in this same old kind of world of ours. But it's true. And so if you've ever wondered, who am I in the scheme of things? Why would God care about me? This day tells you, you matter to God, no matter who you are. You might have some doubts. I think we see it in the story, and I believe it's true, that not only would we respect your doubts and your questions, but so does Jesus. You know, Pastor Jimmy was up here before talking about that thing called Starting Point, and if you've got some doubts and questions, that is a safe place that you can bring those questions. And I believe you owe it to yourself to do exactly that. It's a non-threatening, non-pushy sort of environment. It's just an opportunity to say, what is this thing called faith in Jesus all about? Maybe you've put yourself in that category of people who are too far gone, or maybe you've been trying to work it off, but it just never seems to deliver what we think it is by trying to make it all right. Put your hope and trust in the one who can forgive you completely because of who He is and because of what He has done. And the people who saw it for the very first time understood that when you see life where you expect only death, it's unbelievable. And the implications are personal and eternal. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me. And could it be that today, for the very first time, you need to step across that line of faith and trust as well? It begins by us acknowledging to God the truth about ourselves, that we've missed it, we've blown it. That's true of everybody here in this room. But then we put our hope and our trust in Jesus, who came to rescue us, to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. We ask Him to forgive us. and to make us an adopted child in his family. Because that's the only kind of children he has. Ones who are adopted by his amazing grace and by his power. And it's also a commitment to follow after him, to journey together with him. That's going to be an imperfect journey, but one where we commit ourselves to letting him make the calls, leading, guiding, and directing our lives. And just in the quietness of your own heart, you can take that step of faith and trust. You can express it to him in the words that are right for you. There's not any magic words. It's a sincere heart seeking to be connected to a living God. Lord Jesus, thank you for who you are. Thank you for this day that changes everything. And God, I pray that the impact of what it means would be just as real and just as relevant as it was 2,000 years ago. And just like you sought out people then, you are doing the same today. And God, perhaps in this very room right now, for the first time, we can know that we can belong to you and that you promise never to leave us or forsake us, come what may. And so, God, thank you for the opportunity to honor you, to understand who you are and what you've accomplished for us. And God, I pray that as we go from here, we would all discover many, many different ways in which we could respond to who you are and the grace that you have given. So lead us in that direction, God, not for our name's sake, but for yours. And so we ask and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.